Welcome to Capacity Building Stories Climate Action 101, a podcast brought to you by the Paris Commune on Capacity Buildings Network in partnership with the United Nations University. I'm Eva Costas, your host, and in this series, we're breaking down the essentials of climate action, 101 style. Join us as we explore key concepts related to climate change while connecting the dots between capacity building, research, policy, and practical solutions. Let's dive in. Welcome to Futures Literacy 101. Today's episode is all about futures literacy, the ability to imagine, prepare for, and shape the futures we want. What it means in the context of climate change, why it matters for shaping the future we want, and how building capacity in futures literacy can help communities and individuals prepare for a sustainable and resilient transition. Joining us today are two fantastic guests, Professor and Dr. Shen Xiaomeng and Dr. Isabell Kempf. Could you two please introduce yourselves to our listeners?
Thank you so much, Eva. My name is Shen Xiaomeng. Shen is my family name, Xiaomeng is my first name. And I'm the Vice Rector of United Nations University, and also concurrently I'm the Director of UNU Institute for Environment and Human Security.
Thank you so much, Eva. I'm very pleased to be here. I'm Isabell Kempf. I'm the Director of the UNESCO Institute for Lifelong Learning. And I've worked for over 30 years in the UN, a long time on human rights, but also with UNEP on the question on how to combine climate action with poverty eradication. And now on the question, of course, on lifelong learning. And I think, I would like to share a little bit how lifelong learning can really help us not only to green communities, but to also involve communities in climate action.
Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us. Now let's dive right into the episode. Futures literacy is a concept that we've been hearing more often, but it's new to many of people, myself included. So could you explain to us what futures literacy means in the context of climate change and how it helps us imagine and shape the future we want?
Future literacy is actually going back to how we define literacy. If we can read, we call ourselves literate. Future literacy is really to learn how to read futures. There is not one future, but many possible, probable futures. Future literacy is really about imagination of those futures. I cite Rio Miller, who used to be the chief of Futures Literacy section at UNESCO, and he said we suffer from poverty of imagination. So futures literacy would enable us to free ourselves from our assumptions and the givens and break down all these assumptions, givens, and be in the position to imagine different futures and diversity of the world around us, and also the choices we can actually make.
I think for me, future literacy involves really the human skills. So that's critical thinking, empathy, solidarity, and that includes, of course, also solidarity with nature, not only with other people. And I think we have a great challenge in our times is to really, how can we work with the communities on overcoming both climate denial and also climate anxiety. I think these are the two really extremes on behavior when people are confronted with this rapidly changing environment. And I think it's also in communities where you feel it most, the consequences of climate change. And I think here we can learn a lot from indigenous peoples who have over centuries already dealt with climate change, because often they were pushed into very hostile environments, maybe into Arctic environments, very cold environments, or in the desert into very as I said, hostile and dry environments. So I think we should learn from the past. So how have people in the past dealt with this? So I think there is this historic collective learning that we should not underestimate. And then also, of course, the question, how can we work together on behavioral and system change? And I think here it's really important not to only work with the formal education system because, it's an urgent topic. So we cannot wait until all the 8 years old become president, and not all of the 8-year-old ones will become president, but really work with adult education, lifelong learning in schools, but also beyond in informal spaces, by including people in decision making and providing spaces where people can reflect and discuss climate action and then do it together.
Thanks so much, Isabel. I'd love for you to unpack a little bit more for our listeners that might be new to the topic as well, what lifelong learning really consists of and how is embedded in futures literacy.
I want to give us an example. We are actually facilitating the UNESCO Global Network of Learning Cities. It's a network of 356 cities in nearly 80 countries where we strengthen climate action through lifelong learning. Lifelong learning means community learning, it means informal learning on top of the formal learning system. It means also youth involvement, adult participation in decision making. So I think it is really trying to make sure that people can understand and participate in local climate action. And we have developed for this in the Greening Education Partnership a guidance document that will be launched at the COP30 now on greening communities, which explains what are the minimum requirements, concrete actions for greening your own community. So it is for decision makers, but it's also for people who live in cities to take advantage of the different spaces you have in cities, and in also, of course, the rural communities to participate in action.
Thank you so much for that helpful overview. And now I understand that to really embed futures literacy into our plans for climate action, there's probably some capacity and knowledge gaps. So from your perspective, what would you say are the most pressing gaps that need to be addressed to strengthen futures literacy in this context?
I think if you look at the whole world, it is really not in a very good place. A new report just released some weeks ago by the Planetary Boundaries Science Lab as the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. They reviewed that 7 out of 9 critical Earth system boundaries have now been breached, even one more than last year. If you look at these things, well, climate change is obviously one of them. If you look at all these boundaries which have been breached, it's very easy to fall into the trap of despair because you think, oh my God, 7 out of 9, that's a huge realization. What can we do then? People tend to think there is not much we can do because we have already reached such a tipping point of planetary safety. So escaping from the old ideas and old conceptions is key here, because if you want to change that, you need to have the ability of imagining the present differently. And then you imagine the future in a different way, meaning that you do not extrapolate the past into the future. You do not imagine the present to be fixed in time and will be extrapolated into the future, because this can be changed. So futures literacy also gives you the sense of agency and optimism, really.
Again, we've looked at, right, the ability of futures literacy, of really imagining futures, and then ultimately as well, there's skills that are needed to be able to shape these futures. And you already touched upon imagination, as that I see as a bit of a soft skill, so to say. What other skill sets do you think would be required to essentially make sure that the futures literacy transcends?
I think 2 very important things. One is to think the unthinkable. We are not too far away from COVID-19. I think we still have vivid memory of how COVID-19 happened and happened to us. The point is that we didn't anticipate that COVID-19 would ever happen to us, but it did happen. Actually, we should have anticipated that these kind of things could happen to us, because we have degraded biodiversity and the environment to such extent that this shouldn't have been a surprise. yet it was a surprise to us. So I think using futures literacy is really to also help us to anticipate some of the unthinkable things which could happen to us, especially in climate adaptation, climate risk management. If you could anticipate things which are kind of unthinkable within our daily thinking pattern, then we can much better meet those challenges once they come. Another thing is more of blue sky thinking. I personally am a scientific fiction fan. If you remember that Star Trek in the 80s and 90s, they produced all these series and they ask computers to tell them things. Back then, it wasn't possible at all. But today, it's very normal for us to ask whatever AI to tell us things. How is the weather outside? And how can we explain a certain terminology? So we just do it as a natural thing these days. But it wasn't always like that. So if we can free our mind to facilitate our power of imagination, to have more blue sky thinking, we might find very unusual ways of achieving our goals. So that gives, again, more agency and also more empowerment.
I think there are three really important categories. One is to overcome this linear thinking, right? Just to pretend that something has worked in the past or has not in the work from the past. We have to learn from that, from the past mistakes, and then do things differently in the future. So the future might not be linear. It might be, going in a different way. And I think we need to learn new methodologies like the backcasting, future workshops that need to be very participatory and inclusive, so that people can collectively think about the future, because you cannot change the future by yourself sitting on the sofa. So I think it's very important to create these spaces, as I said, these collective spaces. And then I think the second is really the socio-emotional skills that we need. How to deal with anxiety, how to deal with people who have a different opinion, who deny that climate change exists. You have to be able to enter into dialogue, to engage, to convince, to advocate. So I think all these human skills of engaging with the other, to create that dialogue, to convince, I think are very important skills. And I think movements, young people's movements like Fridays for Future have shown that these are really the skills of the future, because only in this way we will have an impact on politics and on the system change. Then I think also the whole question on how does behavioral change comes about. So you have to really help people to acquire media literacy, critical thinking, and also creativity on how to change people's behavior. For example, by campaigns for healthier and more climate-friendly food. And I think social media has shown that people can change quite fast their eating and consumption habits through interesting, successful media campaigns. And then I think also, of course, the systemic change.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. And now we've looked at some of the capacity and knowledge gaps when it comes to futures literacy, but what are some solutions already that are emerging, or partnerships or research to that are essentially strengthening futures literacy and lifelong learning systems to prepare societies for a green and climate resilient future?
I just would like to kind of give an example of the city of Hamburg, where really there was very successful in their climate action plan to combine formal and informal learning spaces. For example, they launched this climate schools project in 2009 with only 20 schools, where we really action plans include heating, electricity, waste management, nutrition, and mobility in schools. And they worked also with the procurement, so with the providers, the school cafeteria, for example, the parents. And I think now they have nearly 1/4 of all the schools in town follow these action plans and are climate schools. And I think this has led to really an engagement with the wider community of understanding why we need to have not only more sustainable consumption, but also more sustainable production. And I think the caterers avoiding packaging use, parents not using what we call the children's taxis to bring students to school. I think this is an awareness raising that can be very, very helpful in really engaging the community and reduce CO2 emissions in the town. So I just wanted to share that as an interesting practice, because I think also learning cities is not only kind of a label that you get once, you really have to live it and live it with all partners in the community.
We don't really need to look afar, even within our own systems. There are a lot of activities and initiatives emerging. If you think about the Summit of the Future last year and also the Pact for the Future, strategic foresight is a major component of that Pact for the Future. So many UN agencies actually already started practicing futures literacy in their daily work. When I was in New York last year, I saw in the basement there was an exhibition of UNEP, and they actually imagined very different futures. For instance, one example was that they imagined nature at the negotiation table. That's something which is very, very unusual. Is usually beyond our imagination, but they have already integrated those imaginations beyond our daily repetition of our own old thoughts into their exhibitions. I think that's really a good start.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. Now, I'm thinking as well of the stakeholders involved, and I see futures literacy as well and building the futures that we want as a process of co-creation. So what would you say, Xiaomeng, are the key stakeholders that need to be involved in this process?
I think that's a really good question, because we tend to think certain stakeholders need to be involved and certain others might not be so important. But in this case, I think everyone needs to be involved, from the very top to the very bottom, and from civil societies to scientific communities. I think even scientists are often very much trapped in their usual thinking. I think every one of us needs to break out of that kind of thought prison and really to think the unthinkables and to imagine future we want, and then come up with ideas how we can work towards that desirable future, or futures in this case.
Again, the message is clear that everyone should be involved in this process, and both you and Isabell highlighted how futures literacy essentially as well is a essential pillar of capacity building, and I think you've really taught us how futures literacy is all about the ability to imagine the present differently in order to picture the future in a different way. But then as well, we've also learned the need to learn from the past. You mentioned as well the example with the COVID-19 crisis, and again, really helping societies navigate uncertainty and think critically and imaginatively and tap into these cross-cutting skills that are not necessarily valued in maybe more traditional educational settings. So really appreciate all wealth of knowledge that you share with us. If there's any other final messages that you'd like to share with the listeners.
I just wanted to say that I think future literacy is important to look forward and learn to deal with these uncertainties and anxieties, especially when it comes to climate. But it's also important to learn from the past. And I think there are a lot of communities, as I said, indigenous communities, but also youth movements that were really successful in addressing climate change and bring people together for climate action. And I think part of the future literacy is to know your past, to know history, and then and learn from this. I think it's a very important resource that we should never forget.
Well, I want to give the listeners a quote from John Maynard Keynes. And he says, the difficulty lies not so much in developing new ideas as in escaping from old ones. Futures literacy would give us the power to escape from those old ones and to realize the new ones.
Thank you very much for that. And I think that's an extremely powerful note to wrap up the episode. Thank you both so much again for your time and for all the knowledge you shared. Thank you for our listeners for tuning in, and make sure you follow the next episodes of the CV Stories Climate Action 101 series. See you on the next one.